Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Between the Lines. I'm Zach White, editorial associate at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED, and I'm here today with Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, associate professor of history at Georgetown University in Qatar, and editor of the new volume, Football in the Middle East, State, Society, and the Beautiful Game. Thanks so much for meeting with me today, Abdullah.
Thanks for having me.
So this book is absolutely fascinating, and there's no better time to talk about it than with the first World Cup in the Middle East and North Africa about to kick off. It really covers everything. There are 12 chapters on everything from women's soccer in Turkey and what it says about gender inequality there, to how soccer could become part of the BDS movement, to, of course, labor issues in Qatar. So I wish we could talk about all of it, but let's start with something that's been in the news a lot lately, which is how Middle Eastern governments, and especially these days Gulf autocracies, are using soccer as a geopolitical tool. So there are lots of examples of this. There's, of course, Qatar hosting the World Cup, but Qatar and the UAE, or Abu Dhabi in particular, and Saudi Arabia have each bought clubs and pumped in just kind of obscene amounts of money into them. They're hosting tournaments and lots else. So there are plenty more examples from today, but something that comes out of your book is that this is actually not a new phenomenon at all. It's been going on for decades. So I wonder if you could share some more sort of historical examples of governments in the Middle East and North Africa that have used soccer as a tool of power more historically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about this question historically, because the first thing, of course, that we recognize is the fact that this is, one, not unique at all to the Middle East. It's something that I think we see globally, right? That the idea of states wanting to deploy, popular culture as a means of ensuring their own legitimacy or accomplishing kind of specific policy goals is something that's kind of universal, right? That all states kind of engage in this, that pop culture serves as a kind of lubricant between politics or between the state and society in a way that I think is not unique either to this period or to this region. And so one of the things that we look at throughout the volume is kind of thinking about historical examples of this. And, we can see that from the period that a number of states in the Middle East both go through this independence struggle. And then once, of course, they get established as independent nation states, many of them then go through kind of the internal restructuring of sorts politically with a number of military coups that get rid of many of the kind of liberal nationalist elites that were kind of considered part and parcel of the colonial project. And so we think here, for instance, of something like the Free Officers revolution / coup in Egypt in 1952 that brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power, who of course becomes the head of state, but also kind of the head of a major regional project, with Nasserism kind of occupying most people's minds throughout the 1950s and into the late 1960s. And so part of what Nasserist Egypt tried to do, in a way, was try to kind of seize on aspects of popular culture that tended to be quite resonant with the broader society as a means of both legitimizing itself, but also finding a path by which it could even establish greater popularity throughout the rest of the region. And so we see, for instance, that Nasser is made the honorary president of Al-Ahli Football Club. We see that he inaugurates the Cairo Stadium, which has this 120,000 standing room capacity on the 8th anniversary of the Free Officers coup. We also see the establishment of CAF, the Confederation of African Football, which then, of course, Egypt spearheads under Nasser and then becomes seen as a way to kind of reach out to the rest of the African continent. Egypt wins 2 editions of that tournament. South Africa, one of the original 4 members, is almost immediately expelled due to the fact that it was insisting on fielding an all-white team. This, of course, being at the height of apartheid in South Africa. So there's a number of kind of different ways by which states originally were thinking about football as a means of kind of legitimizing themselves and also kind of deploying it through their regional relationships and interactions. We see it again later, once again in Egypt in the Nasser, or going forward to the Mubarak era, when in 2009 you had the situation where Egypt and Algeria were battling it out for this one last spot for the 2010 World Cup. And all of a sudden, I was in Egypt at the time. I remember they were playing this playoff match. And in the lead up to the game, there was so much anti-Algerian hostility. And what's interesting about it, of course, we know that, violence and kind of, heated rhetoric and passion among fans is nothing new. It's a part of the game. for better or for worse, especially when we consider the fact that obviously fan violence is a sad part of the reality. But what we saw in this case was the state was actually leading the charge, that it was state media, radio stations, TV channels, the newspapers, in addition to many of the senior political officials within Egypt that were actually leading the charge by kind of fomenting all of this hostility and hatred toward Algerians. We saw an attack on the Algerian team bus, and a lot of attacks on not just the embassy, but Algerian businesses within Cairo. And all of this was done in a way to try and position Gamal Mubarak, the son of the president at the time, who was trying to kind of be in a position to actually become the next president, right? That there was this kind of hereditary succession project that Hosni Mubarak was pursuing. And so all of a sudden you saw Gamal kind of at the forefront of this, Egypt's kind of new war, so to speak, right? He wasn't in the military like any of the other previous Egyptian presidents. So his battlefield was the football pitch. And so there was this sense that he was going to lead the country into battle. And of course, it ended in defeat, with Egypt falling 1-0 to Algeria in that final match. And by the way, there's a similar side to the story from the Algerian side, where it was also kind of equally deployed as a means of trying to kind of foment hostility toward Egypt. It wasn't quite as heated, perhaps, as the Egyptian side, but certainly the regime in Algeria tried to do the same thing. And so we see a number of these examples, I think, in a way that by the time we get to the Gulf states, leveraging a lot of their revenues from oil and gas as a means of trying to expend influence, both in terms of hosting tournaments like the World Cup being the most obvious example, but also in their purchase of various clubs in Europe, Manchester City FC by the Emiratis, Paris Saint-Germain by the Qataris, more recently, of course, Newcastle by Saudi Arabia. And so there's a sense that these projects are also meant to have kind of geopolitical goals as well, that this is not just about the game or even just about the prestige or soft power, as most people usually kind of just dismiss it as a means of sort of selling your brand as a country, but there's actually real life, political strategic goals that are often pursued, right? So this gives you access to political and economic elites within the country, allows you to kind of lobby on behalf of specific policy goals. And in some ways, even things like, for instance, in 2017, when Qatar decided to go all in on the purchase of Neymar for Barcelona, the 222 million euro price tag was meant to be prohibitive. But not only did they pay that, but they also paid an extra 78 million on top of that to convince the player to move to Paris Saint-Germain at a time when Qatar was, of course, being isolated through the blockade by its neighboring countries. And so again, from a kind of football finance perspective, everyone was kind of in disbelief, right? That this was not a transfer that made sense. But from a geopolitical standpoint, 300 million euros seemed like a bargain, as a way of ending your isolation, or at least confronting your isolation, now that you have one of the biggest football stars in the world, who sort of becomes kind of a brand ambassador for Qatar for the next 5 years leading into the World Cup, which was kind of very intentional, at least if we go back and look at kind of what was happening in that period.
Definitely. Those are all fascinating stories. And it sort of answers something that's been confusing me recently, which is that, the normal explanation given for especially these purchases of football clubs, as well as Qatar hosting the World Cup, is the idea of sports washing. So I think most people are familiar with the term now. It's when governments use sports, soccer in this case, to bolster their own image, sort of as a soft power tool, or to distract from human rights abuses or other things they'd rather people not focus on. And for me, this has been, if that's the purpose of it, it seemed really ineffective lately. So Qatar has really put itself on the map. Lots of people who didn't know about it know where the country is now. But at the same time, it's become synonymous with labor abuses, with treatment of LGBT people, or Saudi Arabia buying Newcastle. There were some fans who would, show up to games with the Saudi flag, but there were much more. I listened to an embarrassing number of soccer podcasts, and all of a sudden they're all talking about the war in Yemen there, which they never would have before. So if it's meant to distract people, it's not exactly doing that. So I thought your chapter was really fascinating in the way it draws out all of the other ways that these governments are trying to, as you say, acquire legitimacy.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, on the question of sports washing and its effectiveness, I mean, it's a really good point because on the one hand, I think you're right that it tends to expose a lot of the abuses that are technically meant to be covered up. But I think if we think about sports washing in a little bit more of a nuanced manner, we can see where it actually becomes effective. It's not necessarily effective among the broader public, and maybe that's not necessarily always even the target. But I think in terms of its interaction among elites, right? So the moment that Saudi Arabia becomes the owner of a major football club, part of the kind of this elite Premier League of just 20 clubs, then all of a sudden they've made inroads among the political and business elites of Britain in a way that makes it far more difficult, for instance, to pursue justice, for instance, in the Khashoggi case, or to lobby against selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, or to try and stop the war in Yemen. So there are certain benefits to how sports washing functions among elites in particular that I think tends to perhaps counteract the overall kind of negative publicity that comes along through kind of the broader discussions in the public.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about one other example that you wrote about in the book of a government, but not a Middle Eastern government, using soccer as a geopolitical tool, which was the United States or the Bush administration using Iraq's run in the 2004 Summer Olympics as building legitimacy in a different way. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, this was a really interesting situation. And it's one that I sort of stumbled on because I remember that Olympics, but I didn't remember seeing the extent to which the Bush administration was really trying to milk the success of the Iraqi team for everything it was worth, right? So kind of rolling the clock back to 2004, we know that despite the fact that, this was a popular war, at least in the early stages, that the Bush administration had kind of overpromised the idea that US troops in an occupation would be accepted and welcomed by Iraqis. Of course, that turned out not to be true. We all remember Bush's infamous mission accomplished speech just within weeks of the invasion in 2003. And so fast forward another year and a half, and now we're in the summer of 2004, and Iraq, of course, is inflamed due to the instability brought on by the US occupation and the kind of the continued violence, which then, of course, bleeds into sectarian competition, violent competition over the kind of the fallout from the collapse of Saddam's government. And so all of a sudden you have this really interesting story whereby the Iraqi football team that couldn't even practice in its own country, that had to go to neighboring Jordan to train, makes its way to Athens for the Olympics, and somehow improbably wins a number of matches in its group stage, makes it all the way to the semifinal match. And so as it's kind of racking up victory after victory, the Bush administration, of course, is looking for any ability to, or kind of any story that it can kind of tie its own fate. At the time, of course, Bush was running for re-election for his second term in the fall of 2004. And so all of a sudden you start seeing Bush mentioning the Iraqi soccer team in his weekly radio address. And then there's this kind of slick TV ad that says something along the lines of, this year the Olympics has 2 fewer terrorist nations and there are 2 more vibrant democracies, of course, referring to both Iraq and Afghanistan. Apparently, had Iraq won its third or its semifinal match to make it to the gold medal match, there were even discussions that Bush would fly to Athens just to be in attendance. Remember, this is an honor that's usually reserved for the head of state, not the head of an occupying power. And there were even discussions that the US was insisting that the Iraqis should come out holding not just their own flag, but also the Afghanistan flag, right? So the idea of kind of even bridging the 2 occupations together. And all of this was kind of being done as a means of kind of legitimizing and showing at least one bright spot at a time when, the Bush administration was certainly foundering given the kind of failures that it had witnessed in Iraq. And so again, this goes sort of to my original point about the fact that this is not a practice that's unique only to autocracies or only to Middle Eastern states, but rather something that we see kind of all states in one way, shape, or form that kind of try to deploy their sporting interest as a means of kind of propping up their own political agendas.
That's fascinating. Let's shift it a little bit toward this World Cup. So obviously Qatar as the host is getting a lot of the attention, but there are 4 other teams from the Middle East and North Africa that are participating in the tournament. So we have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Morocco. The book gives lots of historical examples of ways that regimes have used not just soccer in general, but particularly participation in the World Cup to sort of further their own goals, to shore up support. And so 2 of teams participating in this tournament, Tunisia and Iran, are going through, shall we say, very turbulent periods. And you can imagine that those leaders would like to use this tournament to, pacify the population or something else. So to get a sense of how they might do that, I wonder if you could talk about how Sisi's regime used the last World Cup in 2014 in Russia and how it turned out for them. They won't be in this World Cup, but it might give us an idea of how other governments might try to use it.
Yeah, no, this was a really fascinating story as well. And again, I mean, this was something that I'm sure many of us were probably following casually, just as fans of the tournament who were tuning in to see how Egypt would perform in 2018. This, we're talking, was about 5 years after the 2013 coup that brought Sisi to power, that overturned the uprising in the first place. And so there was a sense, of course, that the regime was very desperately trying to find a source of legitimacy for itself. And so it very aggressively tried to tie itself to the fate of the national team, of course, being as popular as it is, with, of course, its major global star in Mohamed Salah, who by this point was already becoming a household name across the world, given his major success at Liverpool in the English Premier League. The fact that he was, of course, the English Premier League Player of the Year helped to kind of boost the profile, enhance the profile of the Egyptian national team. And so all of this is to say that by the time we actually get to the football, we see that the regime had meddled so much in the team's ability to simply focus on its competition that it ended up performing disastrously, right? It lost all 3 of its matches, including a very humiliating defeat to Saudi Arabia, which usually they're the ones who were kind of finishing the bottom of their group. Salah didn't have a good tournament at all, and I'll explain sort of one of the reasons why in a moment. But there was a sense that from the very beginning, it was so heavily politicized, right? That you had a press conference by the Egyptian Football Association, which basically came out kind of fawning over Sisi, making him sort of this honorary figurehead of Egyptian football by endorsing him. Even FIFA at that point kind of threatened to sanction the Egyptian team because it was not supposed to take an explicitly partisan political position within the country's own, electoral system, if we'd like to call it that. And then, of course, once you get to the training, the Egyptian government made a deal with Chechnya and with the leader, Ramazan Kadyrov, who, of course, is known as kind of this notorious warlord figure within Russia, who then hosts the Egyptian team within his region. And then, of course, you see the photo ops beginning, right? So he's knocking on Mohamed Salah's door in the middle of the night and taking him out and giving him honorary Chechen citizenship and, throwing him a birthday party. And there's all these kinds of strange publicity displays. And then, of course, the reports coming out of the team hotel is that, this is becoming a site for Egyptian politicians, business figures, celebrities, all to kind of come and mingle with the team, which of course has no real ability then to focus on the games and to practice. And so this was all kind of part of the Sisi regime trying to exploit this for all it's worth, this moment. And then we see it in terms even of the marketing, right? So Sisi's regime is accused of kind of exploiting the image rights of Mohamed Salah. They kind of emblazon his face on the Egyptian airplane that is meant to kind of transport the team without his consent. And so then his lawyers start writing letters. He threatens to retire. And he makes a number of kind of very public complaints about the treatment by the state after the tournament. And so this was kind of very much a lesson in how badly something like this could go if the regime kind of very cynically deploys, the footballing, culture or sphere for its own ends in a way that kind of really, really goes badly.
I think we'll all be watching this year's World Cup to see if any countries try to use it in the same way, if any of them go quite as disastrously as Sisi's did in 2018. And switching to another team participating in the tournament, Iran. Obviously, the protests in Iran have captured the world's attention as we're filming this now. We've seen several prominent players speak out in support of the protests, and also a few, such as Hussein Mahini, who took part in the 2014 World Cup, have actually been arrested over it. So the book, comes out before this, so it doesn't talk about the current protests in Iran, but it gives lots of fascinating examples of the ways that soccer fans, like the roles that they've played in protests in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm thinking particularly of Maher Mzahi's chapter about the Algerian Hirak, using soccer chants and tifos, which are these large sort of choreographed banners and signs, and using those in the protests. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the book reveals about the connection between anti-government protests in the region and soccer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because we've spent so much talking about kind of how states deploy their footballing interests and how it can become a tool in the hands of authoritarian regimes. But it's important to know that the game itself, or kind of the idea behind football's role in popular culture and in society, even transcends those kinds of limitations, right? That just because states have tried to control it, to contain it, to monopolize it, and deploy it for their own goals doesn't mean that it doesn't also have the ability to serve as a source of mobilization, of empowerment, of identity. And in this way, of course, we've seen so many examples historically, but I'll just kind of go into the more recent history in the way that, fan groups, so ultras as they're often called, tend to be, a place of, let's just say, less or more limited policing. So, for instance, if we think about the fact that in most countries that we're thinking of, you wouldn't be able to just go and start a political party or have an explicitly political movement, or an ability to mobilize on explicitly political terms. And yet there are other kind of cultural forms that lend themselves over time to having political elements attached to them. And I think in this case, one of the things we heard from a lot of the football fan groups at the time of the revolution, so going back to kind of 2011, 2012, is they said that they were kind of trained for this, right? That in all of their previous confrontations with the police and stadiums, they kind of knew a little bit more about what to expect when Mubarak sent his forces to crack down on the million or so people in Tahrir Square and around other parts of the city and even across the country. And so they kind of stood firm. Now, their stories have become kind of the stuff of legend in Egypt, given how much they were organized and really were effective in challenging, what we saw in terms of the state violence. And at the same time, I think, more recently we've seen it in other kinds of ways, right? So one of the things Maher says in his chapter in the book is the fact that, Algeria doesn't have the same kind of tradition of ultras, right? They don't have these kind of very well-bound, politically mobilized groups in the same way. So the ultras made the decision to attend a protest in 2019 as individuals, but not as an actual organized movement. And yet the impact was nonetheless still very much the same when we consider the fact that it was actually employing symbols of football, right? Thinking about chants, themes that are sung throughout the stadiums on match day, and even these kind of massive banners, these tifo art displays, and all of those were kind of then repurposed in a way to chant down the attempt by Bouteflika, the aging president who hadn't even been seen in public in many years, to try and attempt to run for a fifth consecutive term. And so this was very much about a kind of a different form of mobilization, but I think it tends to show the extent to which, this can take on so many different shapes. And then even going back to the question of Iran, I mean, one of the interesting things that's actually captured in another chapter in the book deals with the protests around the lack of access to stadiums for Iranian female football fans. So, right, we're talking a lot about, of course, what's happening now. But this is kind of in some ways a continuation of a number of other ways in which the state has attempted to kind of police women's bodies and attempt to limit their presence or participation in public life or cultural forms, like just simply attending matches in football stadiums. And so much of the attention to that story tends to be on the outside pressure and the role of FIFA writing these like strongly worded letters demanding the Iranian Football Association allow or permit women into stadiums, but less is talked about in terms of what internally has been done in terms of women who've actually challenged and faced tremendous consequences by trying to simply enter stadiums, sometimes disguised as men, other times explicitly through a protest. And so that's kind of another element to this as well that I think is worth seeing, the kinds of connections between protests and football culture.
Definitely. I think what really comes out of that is that soccer can definitely be a double-edged sword for these regimes. They're trying to use it as a tool to control the population or have some, increase their legitimacy, but at the same time, the fans, the people are using it for their own goals. We're unfortunately running out of time, but let's make sure to end on the pitch. So with the World Cup coming up, Just curious, which Middle East or North African team you think might go furthest in the tournament, a team that might surprise you?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I mean, yeah, I think Morocco certainly is the team that has the most talent, but they've been going through some turbulent times, given changing their coach kind of at the last minute. They've had a little bit of dissension within the team itself, but I think they're well positioned if they can kind of pull all that talent together. They're not in an easy group, so they also have a lot of hard teams to get through in the group stage. I think Qatar is an interesting one. You know, the Qatar, of course, has known that they're hosting the tournament going all the way back to 2010. So they've really had 12 years to build this team. And so when you actually look at the composition of the team, they've been together for this entire time since they were part of the youth program. And the performances so far have delivered. So they come in as the champions of Asia, having won the most recent edition of the Asian Cup. And of course, you know, they're the kind of the hometown favorite in a way, but whether they can get out of the group stage, I think is still very much a tall order. You know, Tunisia and Iran are also kind of, you know, well suited to kind of do something potentially, but they're not in the easiest of groups. I think the Tunisia-France match, for instance, will be a really interesting one. It comes with all sorts of kind of colonial, you know, history there. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia, which generally, you know, comes in having done really well in qualifying, but usually kind of crashes out pretty, you know, pretty spectacularly every time. So not a lot of expectations there, but certainly being right next door, we're expecting the biggest turnout of Saudi fans to any World Cup just because of the proximity. So I don't have an answer, but I think, you know, all of them certainly are really interesting to watch. But I guess I would have to go with Morocco if I'm picking.
I think that's a good bet. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish we could go through everything that was in the book. As I said, there are 12 chapters. We only touched on a tiny part of it, but I really encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Football in the Middle East, published by Oxford University Press, and it's also available as an ebook. So thank you so much for your time, Abdullah, and I hope you have a great time at the World Cup.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Zach.